All right, sub here. Wanted to do a video here because I just have so much information. I'm trying to like figure out how to put it into a video that makes sense. Whether I break it up into like 6 different videos to do one. I think this one video is going to be the way to go. But it's really going to cover two topics. One is kind of the health and size of our current player base in Black Ops 6, and another one is actually going to be looking at the more important question, which is related to the first one. What happens if you remove SBMM from Warzone? Like, what actually would happen if you did that? Um, and then I want to look at a couple of scenarios. If you remove, if you remove it, um, how does that affect the experience of the average player, or the good player for that matter? So it's kind of an interesting topic, and I'm going to bounce back and forth between some slides and my face, um, so that you can kind of get a good look at the information and kind of digest it on your terms. But so the big question is, what happens if you remove SBMM? And the first thing you have to do to have that conversation is answer the question of how many people are playing the game, because that actually makes a huge difference um, in how the models work and how the lobbies would actually distribute. So MW3 versus Black Ops 6. Looking at the first month of launch, and we're going to just kind of use that as a projection of how things are going to go based on previous years. MW3 launch was pretty bad, especially when you look at MW2's launch. And we're not going to look at that data because that is so far out of the norm and out of left field that it's kind of a useless comparison. But it was massive. MW2, uh, you need to hear this from my face. MW2 was the biggest launch Call of Duty has ever had, and it's not close by a mile. There were so many people playing that game, and they played so much. The data is just ridiculous for the first like 2 months of the game, and then it all went away. So drop the ball, missed the bag, blew it, right? However you want to describe it, MW2 could have been the biggest game of all time, and instead it was still considered the biggest mistake for a lot of people, and the numbers bear that out. But I'm not including those numbers because it just throws everything off and it's a distraction. So I want to get that out of the way. But then let's look at the numbers again. MW3 launched in the first month of launch. Okay, this is the first 30 days from the day it dropped fully all the way to that 30-day mark, versus Black Ops 6. Now, Black Ops 6, I'm going to caveat that we're not 30 days from launch at the date that I pulled this information. So these numbers actually carry a couple of days of MW3, the end of the MW3 era, which were pretty abysmal. So these numbers are probably low. All right, you got to probably add about 5 to 7% to these numbers to really understand where we're at. But MW3 in its launch window had 26.2 million players playing every day. Those are individual players across all three platforms, and all elements of those, right? So Game Pass, Xbox premium titles, PlayStation, PC, Battle.net, and Steam. And they played on average for about an hour a session, right? So for every time somebody logged on, they stayed on for on average an hour. Obviously, some people played a lot more than that, and some people played a lot less than that. And then Black Ops 6 launched. In that same period, we probably have 50 million daily players, and they're playing for about an hour and a half a day. So they're adding 50% more playtime to their sessions, and then and they're playing at a much bigger number. So why is that important to ask the question of SBMM, right? I think it's important because when you have and the models that I've created, and I'll talk about those in a moment. The models that I've created that they bear this out, where if you have a wider pool of players to pick from, you actually get a better diversity of lobbies, right? So I tried the model with only a few million players playing, and it was very, very different than if you played with, if you looked at like 50 million players playing, right? So important things to keep in mind. And the other thing to keep in mind is that this is Call of Duty as a whole, right? So that includes um, Black Ops 6 multiplayer, it includes zombies, it includes Warzone, right? All of it is included in here. And so it is important to keep that in mind. And yes, there are legacy titles will come through on that, but you know, I've looked at the data enough to know that they're not a significant portion right now. All right, it's just it is not enough people are playing MW2 to make it worth you know factoring that in. Okay, so so that's an important piece of information that I just want to throw out there. But we're going to look at some considerations as we talk about removing SBMM and what that looks like in the player base. What I did is I built a model based on kind of the KD of the player base. So what is the KD distribution of the player base? And this is something that to be honest, we kind of have a good understanding of it because that was modeled, you know, that was researched and tracked and actually shown to us pretty frequently during the API era, right? Warzone 1. J God did it twice. There's a couple of people on Reddit that pulled that information and did their own distributions, and it all kind of tells the same story. And it didn't change very much over time, right? Very early on in Warzone 1, it was everything skewed a little bit lower, but going forward, it sat around the most common KD, so the average player, is about a 0.83. You might hear people say 0.94, but the reality is that's just the average KD of all players. So if you kill someone, you go up and they go down, and that's a 1 on average, but it's a little bit lower because Tim the Tatman plays and he jumps off stuff and dies on his own quite a bit. So does everybody else. So that's where, you know, the average KD doesn't mean anything. What you want is the most common KD. And so that's what we've done is we've modeled our distribution on what is the most common KD? What are the low end KDs? What are high end KDs? And how's the distribution between them? And so that information is pretty well understood by, I think, most people that really focus on that information. Another important factor is actually playtime. So what is the average playtime in the game? What's on the low end and what's on the high end, right? And so I think one of the things that this is where it gets there's a little bit of guesswork, but I think I have some information on it. So we know what the average playtime is because Steam gives us that information over the last 30 days, and so we can calculate that down to a per player basis, and that's where we get the 1.4 right now, the 1.24 hours in Black Ops 6, and then there is some information that we got during the Microsoft trial that talks about kind of lower end PlayStation players and how often they play the game, and you can kind of correlate that with some skill based on based on kind of the skill differential and where those percentages line up. And then we know that higher end players, higher skilled players, they play the game quite a bit, and that's where a lot of the practice and a lot of the skill comes in. And so I kind of capped that because when I look at Steam or I look at Twitch data, you can kind of get a sense of it, but the numbers, how often they're playing and stuff gets a little weird. But I just kind of capped like the highest end players are playing 8 hours a day, right? And that would be kind of like streamers and that sort of thing, and professional players. And then it scales down from that, right? So like obviously most people are not playing 8 hours a day, but I think a lot of people that play the game a lot play 3 hours, 4 hours a day. That's not an uncommon thing on average over the week, right? They might play a whole weekend and then a couple hours a day every week, stuff like that. And then the lower end where Sony's data actually tells us that they have a very not small percentage of players that they own a Sony console. They own a PlayStation for the sole purpose of playing Call of Duty. It's the only game they play on the console, and they play on those people play an average of 2 hours a week. So we know kind of we have a low end number to work off of, 2 hours a week, and we have a high end number that we're just kind of capping at about 8 hours a day. And then we distribute playtime kind of over skill. All right, it's not perfect. There are different ways to model it, but I think on average, if you take away the outliers on both ends, it works, right? And it makes sense. So there's a playtime consideration that goes into the model that talks about, right, if you are playing a lot, you're probably a higher skill than somebody that plays 2 hours a week or less. And so that's something that we're taking into consideration. Then the size of the player pool matters, because if you only have 10,000 players to pick from, those 10, then the distribution is not even, right? And so you get kind of weird results. if you have too many players to pick from, you know, it changes the results as well. And so what I did is I kind of I did my best to balance it, um, and work with the player population that we know exists, right? So it's about, as I said, Call of Duty has about 50 million active players every day. The assumption is that at any given time, probably a third of those players are playing Warzone. So that kind of is where that assumption, you know, that's kind of where that model comes from. And from previous information that we've had in the past, I think it works. But you know, that's kind of one area with the scale that we're working on. You can go up or down a decent amount, and it doesn't change the model much. So that assumption that a third of players play Warzone when they're playing the game at any given time, it holds up pretty well. And then server locations is something that's important to talk about because right now we have servers that are clustered. We have a few in Texas, we have a lot on the West Coast, and a lot in the Northeast, and then a couple in Florida and kind of down the Southeast. And if we are going to say we're removing SBMM and we're going to have completely random lobbies, you have to redistribute the servers so that everybody is roughly a similar connection to each other. And that process, by doing that, means you just they have to have more servers. And look, we probably need more servers anyways. It will solve most of our server issues, I think, if we just have more of them. But to make this model work, we're going to assume they do that, right? They're not going to cluster people into zones based on their skills, so they're not moving people around dramatically. They're just going to even distribution of servers, even distribution of players, even distribution of it. And these models are based on playing solos, right? Squads, there's no data available to us on how squads would factor into this. We just don't know because we don't have the API. So we're throwing squads out the window. This is just, you know, 120 player lobbies of solo players with no SBMM. All right, assuming that, you know, they're going to get the same connection to a lobby no matter where they are. So what happens if you remove SBMM and all those other factors come into place? And the reality is, you know, if 100 games are going on, the distribution is pretty good, and it falls in line with, you know, kind of with where we would expect it. You have some bad players, you have mostly average players, give or take, some slightly above average, some slightly below, but they account for the bulk of the lobby. And then you get into kind of like the top 20%, which, you know, is one of those things. Historically, the top 20% is about a 1.1, 1.2 KD, right? If you average a 1.2 KD over the lifetime of the game, you are about the top 20% in the game. All right. And then that top 20%, when you kind of, I wanted to break this down so that we can understand where the top 10% is, which sits at about a 1.5. And when you look at the range over one lobby, right? So, there's not going to be a lot of top 10% players in a lobby because of the distribution of players, right? It just doesn't work out that way. And then you look at the top 1%, right? So a 2 KD or better, right? So everybody from, you know, the 2 KDs that we know all the way up to, you know, Joe O and Scump and all those guys, you know, they are not common to actually fill in the lobby. There's on an ideal distribution. So I want to talk real quick about kind of these columns. Average players per lobby is ideal distribution, right? Expected range over the lobby is kind of more realistic, right? Depending on who's available and how often people are playing. And so even though, you know, there's technically 12 spots available for a top 10% player, the odds that there are enough players to fill those spots is actually very low, right? So even though there could be as many as 12 1.5 KD or better players of in the lobby, like in theory, the reality is there just aren't going to be enough of those players to fill those slots. And so the game is going to fill those slots with lower skilled players. Okay. And that's kind of what happens over time, is that the more games that you play, the more the less likely that you run into these players. And so one of the things that's interesting is, so another thing I looked at is, if you take 1,000 player, 1,000 games, in that sample of that 1,000 games, um, where are you gonna run into players of higher skills? And so you will over time, you are gonna run into some higher players eventually, but compared to compared to the smaller sample size of one individual game, right? The odds that your one game is going to have a 2% 2 KD player or better, or even a 1.5 KD player or better, is pretty low. So when you actually look at a one game sample, right? So like if I load into a game, how many 2 KD players are there? The There's only one slot realistically available, and the odds that you will get somebody in that slot is rare. It does not happen very often. And the reality is, in one game, you're only going to see probably a couple, two, three um, players that are 1.5 KD or better, right? So when you look at the distribution of players in the game playing, it's the high end skilled players are not very common. So I asked the model, what happens if you remove the bottom 20% of the player base, right? Which is zero point 0.5 KD or below. So keep that in consideration. Like, this also includes how often these people play, right? But they are a larger chunk of the player base. And just by removing the bottom 20% of the player base, here's what happens to the lobby. The lobby goes crazy. Prior models, lobbies sit on average about a 0.84 KD, which makes sense because the average player is a 0.83 KD. Okay. If you take the bottom 20% of the player base and they just stop playing, like 0.05 players, 0.5 KD players and below, just move on and they go do something else, the lobbies become insane. It models roughly a 0.94 to a 0.98 KD lobby. And the number of high end players that you're going to run into balloons dramatically. So hopefully, going forward, we can keep a healthy player base, and Activision will loosen up some of these matchmaking settings so that we can actually have kind of more balanced lobbies, a more wide range of skill, and people can be rewarded for improving, um, without dramatically punishing the lower skilled players. Like, I don't, that's where we have to get to, and I don't know how to do that personally. It doesn't seem like Activision knows how to do that either, based on last year's game. So, hopefully, going forward, we're finding a better balance between these two systems. But yeah, those are my personal thoughts on it, and kind of where I sit on this topic. But I want to hear what you think on this, given this data, given this information. And yeah, let me know. Drop it down in the description below, and we'll go from there. And we'll catch you on the next one.